He was 79 years old when he said it. Not in anger, not in competition, not even in regret. Just quietly, almost thoughtfully, Barry Gibb had spent a lifetime protecting a sound, a memory, a version of himself the world first met in the late 1960s. He survived backlash. He survived cultural shifts. He survived the kind of public rejection that would have erased most artists completely. But when he spoke about Madonna, there was something different in his voice. It wasn't about charts. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about longevity. It was about becoming someone. And at 79, Barry Gibb finally admitted Madonna became who he couldn't. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. Barry Gibb built a career on Constancy. The voice stayed unmistakable. The falsetto remained sacred. The emotional tone rarely shifted. Even when the world turned on disco in the late 1970s, even when radio stations publicly rejected the Bee Gees during the backlash, Barry did not reinvent himself into something unrecognizable. He stepped back. He withdrew. He wrote for others. He waited. He endured. Madonna did something else. She changed before the world could change her. From like a virgin to ray of light, from lace gloves to spiritual minimalism, from controversy to reinvention, she refused to let a single version of herself define her for long. Barry preserved. So Madonna transformed, and that difference is not small. Within the first few years of their peak fame, both artists faced cultural resistance. The Bee Gees were labeled as symbols of an era many wanted to forget. Madonna was labeled provocative, manipulative, too ambitious, but Madonna leaned into reinvention. Barry leaned into loyalty, and that's where the emotional tension begins. It wasn't about talent. It wasn't about success. It was about change. Barry Gibb became synonymous with a sound so distinct it defined a decade. That kind of identity is rare. It's powerful, but it's also binding. When people hear his voice, they hear a moment in time. Madonna, on the other hand, made sure no single moment could contain her. She allowed herself to be misunderstood. She allowed herself to alienate parts of her audience. She allowed criticism to reshape her. Barry chose preservation. Madonna chose evolution. By the 1990s, this contrast became even clearer. Barry was writing, producing, collaborating. He was respected deeply inside the industry, but he was no longer driving cultural conversation. Madonna still was. She was not just releasing music. She was reshaping image, gender expression, spirituality, controversy, performance art. Every few years, she disrupted her own narrative before the public could solidify it. Barry rarely disrupted his, and that wasn't weakness, it was conviction. He believed in craftsmanship, in melody, in emotional sincerity that didn't require spectacle. His identity was tied to family, harmony, and a particular kind of romantic vulnerability. Madonna's identity was tied to autonomy, control, rewriting the script. One guarded legacy, the other rewrote hers repeatedly. For decades, Barry Gibb stood as a guardian of something stable. When he performed, audiences wanted the songs exactly as they remembered them. My Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love? The falsetto untouched, and he gave it to them. He didn't dismantle it. He didn't repackage it beyond recognition. He honored it. But there's a cost to being remembered for one era as music shifted toward grunge, hip-hop, electronic production. Madonna absorbed those changes. She collaborated with new producers. She risked alienating longtime fans in order to remain present in new conversations. Barry rarely chased new trends. He chose dignity over reinvention. And for a long time that seemed noble, yet in later interviews, when reflecting on careers that sustained cultural dominance across multiple decades, Barry's tone shifted slightly when Madonna's name came up. Not dismissive, not critical, respectful, measured. There was an acknowledgement there, a quiet recognition that she had navigated something differently. It wasn't that he lacked courage. He survived public ridicule during the disco demolition era, by a moment that deeply affected him and his brothers. He faced cultural hostility without abandoning his sound, but Madonna treated hostility as fuel for transformation. Barry treated it as something to outlast. One artist absorbed pressure and emerged altered. The other endured pressure and emerged intact. And at 79, looking back across more than 5 decades, Barry seemed to understand what that difference meant. It wasn't about who sold more records. It wasn't about who was more talented. It was about authorship. Madonna authored her reinventions. Barry protected his origins. There is something deeply human about that contrast. Stability feels safe. Reinvention feels dangerous. Barry built his identity alongside his brothers. Harmony was literal and emotional. His sense of self was intertwined with shared sound, shared grief, shared history. Madonna built hers alone. Isolation can make reinvention easier. Loyalty can make it harder. That distinction matters. Because becoming someone new often requires letting parts of yourself disappear. Barry rarely let himself disappear. Even in periods of reduced visibility, he remained Barry Gibb, the falsetto, the songwriter, the keeper of the Bee Gees' legacy. Madonna allowed old versions of herself to dissolve publicly. And dissolution is not easy. It invites ridicule. It invites reinvention fatigue. It invites risk. By the time Barry reached 79, he had outlived trends, outlived critics, outlived eras that once rejected him. He had earned reverence. His legacy was secure. But security and transformation are not the same thing. When he spoke about Madonna's ability to continually reshape her identity, there was no bitterness. There was something quieter. Recognition. As if he understood that remaining the same requires strength. But so does becoming someone else entirely. And maybe that's the real tension. Was his constancy a strength or a boundary? Because the world remembers Madonna as a shapeshifter. It remembers Barry as a sound. Both are powerful, but they are not the same kind of power. And as we move deeper into his later years, the question becomes unavoidable. Did Barry Gibb protect something sacred? Or did he protect himself from becoming someone new? There is a particular kind of pressure that comes with being remembered too clearly. Barry Gibb knows that pressure. When he walks onto a stage now, decades after the peak of disco, then the audience does not want experimentation. They want recognition. They want memory restored exactly as they left it. The opening chords begin, and thousands of people are transported backward. Not to the present version of Barry, but to the version frozen in cultural amber, and he gives it to them, faithfully. The falsetto still rises. The phrasing still leans into romantic ache. The silhouette still resembles the man who once defined an era. There is dignity in that. But there is also containment. Madonna never allowed containment. In the early 1990s, when public opinion began shifting and conversations around morality, sexuality, and image intensified, she didn't soften, she amplified. She released work that polarized audiences. She embraced backlash as proof she was still provoking evolution. Barry, by contrast, retreated inward when backlash came. After the disco demolition movement in 1979, a moment widely documented as a cultural rejection of disco, the Bee Gees' commercial dominance in the United States declined sharply. Radio airplay shifted. The narrative changed. The tone became hostile. Barry has spoken openly about how painful that period was. He didn't respond by reinventing the Bee Gees into something unrecognizable. He responded by stepping back, writing for others, allowing time to recalibrate perception. He preserved the core. Madonna would have dismantled it. And this is not about who was right. It's about temperament. Some artists survive by anchoring themselves. Others survive by shedding skin. Around the mid-1990s, Madonna entered what many consider one of her most transformative periods. Ray of Light wasn't just a sonic shift. It was a personal reframe. Spiritual themes replaced provocation. Motherhood softened her public image. Electronic textures replaced earlier pop formulas. She allowed herself to change publicly. Barry's changes were quieter. His later career involved touring, honoring the Bee Gees' catalog, and carrying forward the identity that audiences already cherished. His evolution was subtle, not structural. That difference becomes sharper with time, because the longer a career lasts, the more identity calcifies. Madonna constantly disrupted her own calcification. Barry didn't. And there's something emotionally complex about that choice. When artists remain constant, they protect a memory for millions of people. They become custodians of nostalgia. They offer stability in a world that moves quickly. But constant artists also live inside the expectations of their past. Madonna repeatedly stepped outside those expectations, sometimes successfully, sometimes controversially, but always deliberately. Barry's strength was continuity. Madonna's strength was reinvention, and here's where the tension deepens. Continuity builds reverence. Reinvention builds relevance. Those two words sound similar. They are not. Reverence is about being honored for what you were. Relevance is about being discussed for who you are now. Barry achieved reverence. Madonna fought for relevance. Neither path is easy, but they require different emotional tolerances. To reinvent yourself publicly means tolerating criticism from the very audience that once loved you. It means accepting that some people will prefer the older version of you. It means risking decline in order to attempt renewal. Barry rarely risked alienating his core audience. Madonna did, repeatedly. By the time Barry reached his later decades, his concerts became celebrations of legacy. His interviews carried warmth, reflection, gratitude. There was no sense of chasing modernity. There was no urgency to redefine himself for younger listeners. He seemed at peace with the era that made him iconic. Madonna, even into her 60s, continued to reposition herself. New collaborations, new aesthetics, new controversies. She refused to be archived. Barry allowed himself to be archived, respectfully, honorably, powerfully, but archived nonetheless. And at 79, looking across the span of these two careers, the contrast feels almost philosophical. Barry's identity was intertwined with brotherhood. The Bee Gees were never just a band, and they were family. Reinvention would have required reimagining something sacred. Harmony was not just musical, it was personal history. Madonna's identity was solitary. Autonomy gave her flexibility. Barry's loyalty gave him solidity. But loyalty can anchor you to a fixed image. Autonomy can free you to evolve. Somewhere in that contrast lives the quiet admission implied in his reflection. He could preserve, she could transform. And there's another layer here, one that surfaces slowly when you examine longevity. As artists age, they face a question that isn't always spoken aloud. Do you adapt to the era, or let the era adapt to your memory? Barry chose the latter. Madonna often chose the former. In interviews over the years, Barry has expressed admiration for artists who navigate change successfully. His tone is rarely competitive. It's contemplative, as if he views the industry not as a battlefield, but as a landscape of different survival strategies. He survived by staying true. Madonna survived by shifting shape. And maybe what he recognizes now isn't a failure, but a limitation of temperament. Not everyone is built to dismantle their own identity publicly. Some people are built to guard it. There is courage in both paths. But one path keeps you culturally fluid. The other keeps you emotionally consistent. As Barry reflects at 79, there's a subtle understanding in the way he speaks about artists who constantly redefine themselves. It's not envy. It's not self-criticism. It's awareness. Awareness that reinvention requires a certain restlessness. Barry has never seemed restless. He has seemed rooted. Rooted in melody. Rooted in family. Rooted in the sound that made him who he is. Madonna has always seemed untethered. Untethered from a single genre. Untethered from one image. Untethered from audience expectation. And perhaps what Barry finally admits isn't that he lacked talent, or vision, or courage. It's that he lacked the instinct to become someone entirely new when the moment demanded it. Because becoming someone new often means leaving parts of yourself behind. Barry rarely left himself behind. He carried his past forward. Madonna let her past fall away. That's the emotional divergence. One protected memory, one disrupted it. And as the years pass, disruption often echoes louder in modern culture than preservation. But preservation builds something quieter. It builds trust, it builds loyalty, it builds a legacy that doesn't fracture. As we move toward the final chapter of this reflection, the question grows sharper. Was Barry's constancy an act of strength? Or was it a line he could never cross? There is a moment that comes to most artists who last long enough. It doesn't arrive with headlines. It doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, usually in reflection. By the time Barry Gibb reached 79, he had nothing left to prove. The catalog was permanent, the influence undeniable. The losses he endured, his brothers, the backlash, the eras that moved past him, had already reshaped his inner life more than any critic ever could. What remains at that stage isn't ambition, it's perspective. And perspective softens rivalry into understanding. When Barry speaks about Madonna now, when there is no comparison of chart positions, no competitive framing, what lingers instead is recognition of difference. Because over decades, he watched her do something he never attempted. She separated herself from her origin story. Barry never did. The Bee Gees were not just a band for him. They were identity, grief, loyalty, shared childhood, shared survival. To reinvent too radically would have meant stepping away from that collective self. Madonna's brand was singular from the beginning. She could dismantle it without dismantling family memory. That distinction is not small. Reinvention is easier when you are only accountable to yourself. Barry was accountable to history, to harmony, to a shared voice that defined a generation. Every time he stepped on stage after the passing of his brothers, He wasn't just performing songs, he was carrying legacy, and legacy can anchor you in place. Madonna treated legacy differently. She treated it as a chapter, not a container. When cultural tides shifted, she didn't hold tighter to the version people loved most. She risked disorientation. She risked backlash. She risked aging publicly in ways that made audiences uncomfortable. Barry aged privately within familiarity. Madonna aged publicly within transformation. And that difference reveals something deeper about identity. Some people are strengthened by consistency. Others are strengthened by disruption. Barry's emotional stability was tied to continuity. The falsetto remained. The songwriting craft remained. The essence remained. Madonna's emotional currency was motion. She kept moving. Sometimes the movement was applauded. Sometimes it was criticized, but it was movement, and movement keeps you current. Barry's path kept him respected. Madonna's path kept her discussed. At 79, looking back, Barry doesn't sound like a man who regrets his choices. He sounds like someone who understands their consequence. He preserved something beautiful. But preservation can make reinvention harder, because when millions of people attach you to a memory, stepping away from it can feel like betrayal. Madonna rarely seemed afraid of betrayal. She seemed comfortable with discomfort. That comfort is rare. It requires a willingness to be misunderstood. Barry rarely invited misunderstanding. He invited recognition. That may be the core of the admission implied in his reflection. Not that he lacked ability, not that he lacked bravery, but that he valued steadiness over reinvention. And steadiness does not produce the same cultural elasticity. There is another layer here, one that only becomes visible late in life. Time exposes the architecture of your decisions. When you are young, consistency feels like identity. When you are older, you can see whether that consistency limited you or protected you. Barry's consistency protected him from fragmentation. It gave him clarity. It gave him artistic integrity. It gave him a career that feels cohesive, but it also fixed him in place during eras when the industry rewarded mutation. Madonna mutated. Barry endured. Both survived, but they survived differently. And perhaps that is what he finally understands. Madonna became a symbol of self-recreation. She embodied the ability to detach from previous versions of herself without apology. Barry embodied loyalty to origin. If you listen closely to the tone of his later reflections, there's no envy in it. There's respect. Respect for a different temperament. Because becoming someone new every decade requires a certain emotional distance from your past. Barry never distanced himself from his past. He honored it. He carried it forward. He sang it the same way. And audiences loved him for it. But loving familiarity is different from demanding reinvention. Madonna demanded reinvention from herself before the audience could demand it. That's strategic, but it's also psychological. It suggests a comfort with self-disruption. Barry's strength was harmony. Madonna's strength was autonomy. Harmony resists fracture. Autonomy invites it. By the end of this comparison, what feels most striking is not who did it better. It's how clearly their differences mirror two ways of surviving fame. One path protects what made you iconic. The other path abandons it repeatedly. At 79, Barry Gibb seems fully aware that he chose protection. Madonna chose abandonment. Of old skins, old sounds, old images he could preserve, she could transform. That does not diminish him, it defines him. And perhaps the quiet power of his admission lies in its calm acceptance. He did not become someone else. He remained himself. Madonna became multiple selves. Both paths demand strength, but only one keeps you culturally fluid across decades. The other keeps you emotionally intact. And maybe that's the deeper truth beneath the comparison. Barry didn't fail to become Madonna. He simply refused to stop being Barry. Madonna mastered the art of departure. Barry mastered the art of staying. And at 79, that difference feels less like competition and more like understanding, not regret, not envy, just clarity. Clarity that reinvention is not universal. Some artists evolve by shedding. Others endure by holding on. Barry held on. Madonna let go. And in that contrast, we don't just see two careers. We see two philosophies of identity. One that moves, one that remains. We're neither wrong, both revealing, and sometimes the quietest admissions carry the most weight.